Do Americans know the Green Book? Do they know what it represents? How many lives did it potentially save? And most importantly, do we still need a Green Book today? The answers to these questions can be discovered on the road. Hence, the necessity of a journey driving the Green Book. You're going to experience what I call the myth of the American highway, which is something you may not be familiar with. When I grew up, there were all these ads on television. See the USA in your Chevrolet, right? The idea that the road trip meant freedom. You could go out and drive the roads and see America. But that wasn't true for African Americans during that period of time because of laws in different states called Jim Crow laws, and because of pervasive segregation. You couldn't just experience the beauty and the freedom of the American roadway. There was a whole difference about traveling then compared to today.
Vacation without aggravation. I think that tagline really stood out for me. When I first heard of the Green Book, I thought, oh my gosh, like the green is like a green light, like that's where you can actually go. But as I've been looking through the book, I realized that it was actually just named after Victor H. Green. So that was something that was super duper new to me. But I think it fits both bills. Like it's a green book, it's where you can go, and it's also named after Victor Green.
I love that.
Hi, everyone. It's Virginia Stanley and Lainey Mays and Harper Academics on Michael Finan. And you've just watched a short clip from a longer clip that we've made available in our chat room. And that's Alvin Hall, along with two of his friends in the car, talking about the Green Book. And we're here to talk today with Alvin and his editor, Biz Mitchell, about Alvin's forthcoming book, Driving the Green Book, a road trip through the living history of Black resistance. Alvin and Biz, welcome to our program today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you on today and to talk about this book and this whole experience and the history and the research and your experiences and the stories that you've been told. And we're looking forward to getting right to it. But first, some brief introduction. So as I said, today our guest author is Alvin Hall, award-winning television and radio broadcaster, author, political activist, and renowned financial educator. His numerous radio programs include The Tulsa Tragedy That Shamed America, The Green Book, and Jay-Z, From Brooklyn to the Boardroom, all on BBC. And for 5 years, he hosted the highly rated and award-winning BBC series, Your Money or Your Life. His forthcoming book, coming out on January 31st, 2023, Driving the Green Book, explores the history of America's segregated past through a journey across terrain once considered too dangerous for a Black traveler to navigate, and which still bears those scars. Joining in this conversation today is Alvin's editor, Elizabeth Mitchell. Biz is an executive editor at Harper One. She's also the author of 4 books, including works of history. Her recent titles at Harper One include The Illustrated Black History by George McCalman and Transformer, a story of glitter, glam, rock, and loving Lou Reed by Simon Doonan. Welcome, Biz. Welcome, Alvin.
Thank you so much, Virginia. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's particularly wonderful to be someone facilitating your meeting Alvin, because he's one of the most delightful, brilliant people that I have come across. And so I'm so excited to have this conversation. I wanted to start right off by asking Alvin Alvin, can you tell the story of how you originally came across the Green Book and why you decided to write about it? I know it's in the book itself, but yeah, if you could just share that with everyone.
Yes. Because of my work with the BBC, Biz, I used to fly back and forth to London all the time. And during one of those trips, I was looking at a magazine because I tended to buy magazines when I travel, and I saw a mention of the Negro Motorist Green Book. And I thought, I've never heard of this. And I continued to read, and there was no mention of segregation in the article, but it just stayed with me. Why did I not know about this book? So as soon as I came back to New York City, I went to the Schomburg up in Harlem, the Schomburg Center for Black Research, and I began to look for the Green Book. And to my amazement, they have the largest collection of them in America. And I met this wonderful librarian there, Myra Liriano, who brought them out. And at the time, she could put them on the desk and I could actually touch them. And that began my Green Book journey. At the same time, unbeknownst to me, in Wales in England, a BBC radio producer named Jeremy Grange had also read about the Green Book in a magazine. And he thought it would make an interesting story. And through a series of connections, somebody told him, well, why don't you call Alvin? Maybe Alvin will be willing to host the show. And he called me up and I immediately said, yes, I will. And I just thought it was fated that the two of us in totally different parts of the world read about this and became fascinated with it. And that's how my Green Book journeys began.
Now, I find it so interesting that your journey started out where the journey of the Green Book began, because not only is it held in that archive in New York, but the Green Book itself started in New York. And I thought that was very interesting because, you know, if anyone knows about it, I think they think of it as this guidebook to the South to, you know, to help people who are traveling through dangerous territories in the South. But the fact that the founder created it for New York, I think is really interesting. So could you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. Victor Hugo Green, who created it with his wife, Alma, they lived in Harlem. And we have to remember that this was the time of the Harlem Renaissance. So it was an active place full of creatives of all types. Victor and his wife lived on St. Nicholas Avenue. He worked as a postman in Hackensack, New Jersey. And when he would and his wife would go south in the summer to visit her relatives in Virginia, they would encounter what he called aggravations along the way. And in response to those aggravations, as well as those he heard from his friends who also took trips to the South and to other parts of America, he was inspired to create the Negro Motorist Green Book in 1936. And they really started it out of their apartment. Eventually, it was moved to an office on 135th Street and what is now the Thurgood Marshall Academy. And it ran from that location until its final publication in 1967. So in many ways, this publication reflects the creativity and entrepreneurial spirit that was going on in Harlem in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s.
And it was documenting much of the sort of the places where people could go in New York where they would be safe and accepted and welcomed as well. I thought that was, very intriguing that you have in there about the fact that many entertainers, had only particular places they could stay in New York and feel comfortable.
Yes, everybody assumes that the Green Book is about the South, as you said, but in reality, it covered the whole United States. Mm-hmm. And it started in the first issue focusing on the New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut area, with the largest portion of the book dedicated to New York City. If you look at what's in there, in particular about Manhattan, there was very little below the 125th Street area, almost nothing. During this time, of course, many African-American stars were playing at nightclubs in Midtown Manhattan at the Empire Room at the Waldorf Astoria, but they could not stay there. They all had to stay in the Waldorf Astoria of Harlem, which was the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street. That building is still there. It was Ron Brown, who was in, I think, the Clinton administration, he was actually born there grew up there. And the building still exists today as an office building. But this was where those people who played in Midtown, those big stars, Lena Horne, Pearl Bailey, Dorothy Dandridge, and Eartha Kitt, this is where they played. And there's one of the best things about doing a book like this. is that you're talking about it sometimes with your friends during the research phase of the book, and all of a sudden they said, oh, you should talk to somebody. And I was having this discussion at a dinner conversation, and the person there was John Heyman, who was a film producer. And his first job when he came to America from England was to be the press agent for all of those 4 women.
Wow.
And he was the one who shared with me the story that they could not stay in the Waldorf Astoria.
And that points to something very unique about your book. And the thing that got me very early on and made me want that book to come to Harbor One is that you, instead of doing a sort of straight history, you decided to go out and find people who were the living witnesses of the segregation that the Green Book was trying to, mitigate the ill effects, or, keep people safe even in the situation of the kind of terrible segregated America of those decades. And so can you talk a little bit about that part? And also, Michael, if you want to show those first 3 images while we're talking, that would be great. It's pictures of the Green Book that were in the archives of the library. And then there's a picture of New York back in the early days of the Green Book, just to show you kind of what Harlem looked like back at that time. Oh, and this is Victor Green and Alma Green, his wife, who were the creators of the book. And then the next one is of New York City. Yeah, and we can pause there. But yeah, Alvin, can you talk a bit about the use of eyewitnesses in your book?
When I started out the project, I really did think it was going to be a sort of recounting of the road trip. But at every stop, without my even asking, someone would say, you may not have time with this, but let me tell you this story. Or before you leave, I just remember. And those stories became so moving and rich, and they captured what actually happened in those people's lives. Yeah. And they were laced with humor sometimes, with silence at the end of them, with anger, but they were full of all of the great emotions that make a story great, that reflects the lives that people have lived. So at the end of the second road trip from Detroit to New Orleans, I began to rethink the entire idea of this book. What was most important? The voices of the people. What did I struggle with most during the interviews? The cadence of the people, the tone of voice, the stories that they were telling. And what they often left me with was a wisdom about what they had lived, how they had survived, and how they continued to maintain their optimism about the future for themselves and for their children and their overall families, and for African Americans in general. Yeah. So that helped me reframe the book in my own mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's first of all, it's an opportunity to hear those voices, because I mean, I think first of all, people like to think of this as such a distant past, and that yet you're, I mean, we're going to get to a photo of you at that time too, and you yourself are a living witness, and I think it helps connect it a lot to younger readers too. I mean, I would imagine that it's much easier to understand the profound impact of these laws when you hear them from the people who actually experience them. So that I feel like the book has that possibility of having a readership from, young people, up to, our oldest readers. Can you?
I agree with that.
Can you tell us why I love the choice of going to Detroit. So you were in New York, you're doing research, then you travel over to Detroit to start the actual road trip. And why Detroit? Like, what was the significance of Detroit?
The Museum of Modern Art had an incredible show that changed my whole idea of where to start the trip. The show was about Jacob Lawrence's migration series, a series of 60 paintings, half of which are at MoMA, the other half of the Phillips Collection in DC, about the Great Migration and the struggles that Black people had during that period of time. At the beginning of that exhibition, there was an infographic, and you could go there and touch it in various cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit. And what stood out for me was the population increase in Detroit. In 1910, the African-American population of Detroit was 1.2%. By 1970, it was 43.75%.
Mm-hmm.
That was an incredible increase.
Mm-hmm.
What had caused this? I wondered. Why was it so much bigger than all the other cities in the infographic? And it was because of the automobile industry. African Americans were leaving the rural agricultural South and moving up there to have jobs in the thriving and growing automobile industry and all the related industries because they could earn more money. And it looked like there would be great opportunities. It was the land of milk and honey. And so that's why I chose Detroit. And then doing more research, I started to look at where people came from in the South to move to Detroit, from Georgia, the Florida Panhandle, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. So we wanted to do that road trip back home, back to the South, to where those people came from.
It's so interesting. And then on top of it, you have some very fascinating things about what the car represented to African American, and not just, getting jobs in the auto industry, but then what it meant to acquire an auto and can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, what's so interesting about those stories for me is that they reflect how I thought about cars in the place where I live, because we were too poor to own a car. But when people had taken the risk to go up to Chicago to get these new jobs, to start their lives over, if they could save up the money for a car, it meant they had arrived because they had independence. They no longer had to depend upon the public transportation in that area, the buses and the train, where they could be Jim Crowed, a word that I learned during this process. The car gave them freedom. And so it really was not only a symbol of achievement, but a symbol that you were essentially the master of your own fate on the road, at least in part. And that also led to an incredible release of creativity for many people. For the first time, not only were they in charge of navigating their own way through the roads of America, but they could start thinking about how they could navigate their socioeconomic growth in America, and therefore participate in the American dream.
Yeah. And let me just say too, we're getting some questions in the chat, and I'm going to get to all of them, hopefully. And please add more to all the people watching this interview. But now, and the other thing about the car was it was shelter too, right?
Yes, it was protection, so that when you were on those long road trips, if you needed to take a break, you had a big, comfortable car that the children could stretch in on the back seat, that you could lean back in the front seat and grab a nap. When I was growing up, everybody would say, oh, Black people spend all of their money on these big cars. They're being so wasteful. What people forgot was that Black people couldn't buy cars, number one. So the
couldn't
major
buy homes.
Couldn't buy homes, sorry. Yeah. They couldn't buy homes, which was the major wealth building tool in America. So what was the next biggest one? Your car. But your car also gave you protection on the road and comfort, because you couldn't stay in hotels. You couldn't get places to eat. So the car gave you the comfort and the security while you were on the road. It took one little bit of worry off your plate.
Well, and so that allowed, so the book, the Green Book, is both trying to get people to the places along the road that are going to be places they can stay that are safe, but the car can be that interim place to stay. And one of the questions we have is from Susan. She says, how did Mr. and Mrs. Green keep the book lists current? Like, how did they keep those lists of where you could be safe and, you know, or new ones that would come in and all that?
Victor Green was a member of a postman's association. There were actually two, a white postman's association and a black postman's association. Victor belonged to the white postman's association because it was in New York City and New Jersey. Those postmen, especially the African-American postmen who were in Black neighborhoods, would get information and say, you should feature places like this in your publication. So they were the first ones to help him bring in the listings. They also informed people about the Green Book. So some of those local businesses looking to grow themselves would send their information to Victor Green, and Victor Green would attempt to vet it the best way that he could. As the magazine grew to cover all of America, he actually had agents out in America who would go and look for places and encourage people to advertise in the Green Book. It was published every April or May, every year, and except for a couple of years during the war. And it was designed so that people could keep it in their glove compartment. And every time he would update it each of those years with new places. And eventually it became quite large.
Yeah, at one point, 2 million copies were sold or something.
That's the estimate. No, there were no business records left, but all the estimates that I've read in several different publications say that approximately 2 million were probably sold across America at its height. That's how important it was. African Americans were experiencing new financial freedom or at new financial options, my favorite word, and wanted to see America. They wanted to go on the road, and they wanted to travel back home for graduations, for funerals, for family reunions. And the Green Book gave them a sense that they could find a place of safety when they were on the road if they needed to.
Yeah. I mean, even just what you've just laid out is so unbelievable to me in terms of, you know, in your subtitle, it has the word resilience, and it's the Black resilience. Like the fact that given the like horrors and indignities that were unleashed at that time, that there would be a network, there would be a postal worker who decides he's going to make this book, and then he's got the network of other postal carriers who are providing information. And then, you know, and we'll get into it in a bit, but the idea that through this, they're also creating real thriving economic centers for Black Americans, because they then knew where to go, you know, what streets and what cities would have the best, you know, restaurants and all the rest. I mean, it's amazing.
And they were called little Harlems across America. All of these places, Jefferson Street in Nashville, Walnut Street in Louisville, Ferry Street in Jackson, Mississippi. Every town and city had one of these places that was the center of Black life and the center of Black entrepreneurship at that time. And Biz, one of the best things that came out of the book, and you really helped me realize this and feature it in the book, while the Green Book itself was a reaction to the restrictions of the white world, one of the things that I put into the book was what it was like within the Black communities away from the white world, away from the white gaze, where Black people weren't thinking about white people. We were just living.
Yeah.
We were just living our day-to-day lives, you know, and part of that was, you know, sharing the Green Book among ourselves, how Black people protected their children from the horrors of racism, both in their communities and on the road. So the book really offers a perspective, not only about what was going on the road, but what was going on in those African-American communities across America that caused them to thrive.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of the places that you talk about, and particularly the towns and those resort towns, and I mean, it just seems as if, I mean, there's so much sadness in the book, but there's so much joy too. I mean, the different communities where, you know, great talent could flourish, where, you know, families had long traditions of, you know, enjoying each other's company across, you know, different family circles. It's amazing.
Oh, especially when you talk about the Black resorts, that has just opened up a world to me
Yeah.
that I had no idea about. Once I met Mary Ellen Tyus in Columbus, Ohio, and she had spent all of her summers since she was a little baby going to Idlewild, Michigan. And we joke that she's part of Idlewild royalty. And then just again, having discussions with friends about this project. Can you believe 4 of my friends have bought places in those historic Black resorts in the past year?
This is excellent for your, this bodes very well for your summer plans.
Yes.
Okay, so Lillian wants to know, how did people find out about the Green Book, and where was it sold? And I thought ESSA was a very interesting part of this story. So please,
Yes, the Green Book was basically sold at Black newsstands all across America. And of course, remember, you had the Black porters on all of the trains during that period of time. So when they traveled, they would often take it with them, and they would drop it off at local places where they were staying so that it was available in these local towns and cities across America. Esso, today Exxon, was the first gas station and the only one to allow the Green Book to be sold at its station. Now, it did not mandate it at every station, but many of them carried it. And we have to think about this. Esso was started by the Rockefellers, and Laura Spelman Rockefeller was from a Cleveland family who was very much involved in abolition. So when you think about that, it makes sense that they would be open to allowing this book to be distributed at those stations. I had the wonderful experience down in New Orleans of talking to a man who carried it at his newsstand. And he would say that he got it from the Pullman porter who came down there, and that's how he ordered the Green Book.
that's
And you could also get it by mail. So they sold it by mail through the post that could come to you, or you could walk up and get it if it was sold nearby. So those are the primary ways it was distributed.
that's amazing.
Alvin, I'm sorry, I just wanted to, were there ever any other gas stations? What is this, strictly Esso all the way? Was it, did they
It
ever?
was pretty much Esso. There were other, I think, there were other publications. Go, which was another competitor to the Green Book, it was sold at another gas station, I think Texaco. But all the research I've found that the Green Book was only sold at Esso service stations, only available at Esso service stations.
And Esso was the only place that, I may be wrong, but I got the impression that it was the only franchise that allowed Black ownership of
That's
the
right.
stations, right? And you have some stories in there that are just like, I mean, things you don't even, we think of the water fountains and the, seating in restaurants and things and all that being separate, but even some gas stations wouldn't sell gas to Black travelers.
Absolutely, especially in the South, they would not want to touch something that Black people drove. They would not allow them to buy gas. Some of them, if you pulled up, they would make you wait. And then if you tried to drive away, they'd pull a gun and make you wait until they were ready to serve you. A guy in Tallahassee, Florida told the story of being in Butler, Georgia, and stopping at a gas station and asking to use a service station. And the guy said they were out of order. They had a Black man servicing his car. And he said to him, those bathrooms are fine. They just don't want you to use them. So the driver of the car, a Black man, said to the white attendant, oh, could you show me the bathrooms? Could you let me see that they're out of order? And a white motorist, also getting his car serviced, walked up and slapped the man and said, we don't like your kind around here. That's the type of thing that could happen like that on the road. An innocent question, asking to use the bathroom, could lead to violence.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, it's not that long ago. I mean, that's the thing is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But I mean, this had to exist until 1967, first of all, as a guidebook. And we know we're not over it entirely, even today. But there was, let me just give, Kimberly's been very patient and had a question. Which story that you heard surprised you the most? Either, I guess, from an eyewitness or from, one of your, your sources in general?
Oh, that's a very good question. Which one surprised me the most? I suppose it was Carl Westmoreland's story in the 90s, driving around Atlanta, stopping at a service station there, and the white attendant not wanting to let him use the bathroom after he'd filled up his car with gas, and he challenged this guy. And luckily, his son, who played football, came up and got between him and this guy, got between Carl Westmoreland and this guy, and told him, "Dad, go use the bathroom." And that was in the 1990s. The other story that probably affects me the most, I think I live with the story in my head, is that of Hank Sanders growing up in poverty in Alabama, and how he talks about the strength of his mother and father. I will admit to you, Kimberly, I cannot even read that passage without crying. I had to really struggle during the interview not to cry, because his words are so powerful, because he ends that story by describing his mother's peculiar confidence in her children, and that what gifts his parents had that he hopes he embodies today. It's one of the best stories in the book, and the one with which I live every day.
Michael?
Yeah, speaking of stories, I want to jump in with a question we have from Wanda back in the Facebook chat. And she wants to know, what did you think of the movie The Green Book, which I know for myself and a lot of other people is, probably their first exposure or way of hearing about it. So what were your thoughts on the movie? I know you do talk about it a little bit in the intro, but.
Yes. I went to a screening of the movie here in New York City, and at the end of the movie, 70% of the audience was crying. I was stunned by that. At the end of the screening, Mahershala Ali, Viggo Mortensen, Peter Farrelly, the composer, and everyone came to the stage, and there was a 30-minute Q&A. And during that 30-minute Q&A, the moderator asked them, "Well, before you started the movie, had any of you heard of the Green Book?" And the answer was no, 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 across the board, which was not surprising, but sort of kind of surprising to me. And it really lit a fire in me to make sure that this book came out. When I finally saw the movie, I thought, the movie is a buddy movie. It's told solely from the perspective of the driver. It has nothing really to do with Don Shirley. The Green Book only appears in a few names. Peter Farrelly said that he chose the name, The Green Book, because it just struck him as something he wanted to do, and it was a travel guide, and the movie was about this trip to the South. The movie really has nothing to do with the Green Book itself. But the one thing the movie did do, it made people aware of the Green Book, and among some African Americans, it spurred them to become interested in looking at what this publication might be.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to, there's to me, one of the things that seems so poignant is that the Lorraine Motel was in the Green Book as a place, listed as a place of sanctuary at one point. It was Black owned. It was, I'd love for you to talk about what it offered, but also can you talk about what you learned about the Lorraine Motel and when you were on the trip and stopped there?
Just driving up to the Lorraine Motel as an African American who recalled vividly the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated and the images of that day, just driving up to the Lorraine is fraught with emotion. I don't deny that. I carry those images in my head. I've seen them throughout my life. So getting there was like a pilgrimage. When it's beautifully done, combining the National Civil Rights Museum with the Lorraine Motel. So you really go on a civil rights journey until you reach the room where Martin Luther King was staying. It is a recreation of the room with everything there the way it was the day he was assassinated. And then you hear Mahalia Jackson's voice singing Precious Lord. Wow. It's rich, it's layered. You cannot help but be moved. And the first time I went there, people were sobbing. I mean, sobbing. It was very hard to maintain my composure. I interviewed Dr. Noel Trent, who's in charge of education interpretation at the National Civil Rights Museum. And then she filled me in on the history of Walter and Loree Bailey, how they formed a team to buy this hotel and then build it up. And the history is so fascinating. When they could not get the food that they wanted from the local wholesalers, Loree said we should buy a farm outside of Nashville and grow some of our produce and buy things from local farmers, so it becomes in effect a farm to table restaurant, an early one in Nashville. Stack Records was right up the street, so you had all of those recording artists staying there. Wait Till the Midnight Hour was written by Wilson Pickett and Steve Cropper at the Lorraine Motel. Knock on Wood was written in a room at the Lorraine Motel. Mavis Staples stayed at the Lorraine Motel. It's rich. And on the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, Loree Bailey was on the switchboard and, taking all those phone calls, calling emergency. And she said to one of the people working there, I don't feel very well. I'm going to go upstairs and lie down. She went upstairs and she never woke up again on the day that the assassination occurred. She then died on the day of the funeral. Mm. So for the Bailey family, that day is very complex and fraught with many emotions. Not only did they lose, Loree, but this business that had sustained them. And it's understandable then why the business began a very slow decline until it was about to be auctioned. But the African-American community of Memphis was not going to lose the battle to save the Lorraine, and started by Charlie Scruggs, who was a local television person, and many other people in the business community, including Jesse Turner Sr., who was then president of the Tri-State Saving Bank. They pulled together a coalition of people. And from the public, from a lot of sources, they raised enough money so that when the Lorraine was put up for auction, they were able to place the winning bid and save the Lorraine Motel. It's an incredible story.
It really is.
About a family, about their loss, but then about the community's understanding of the importance of this place in African-American history, but more importantly, in American history.
Yes, absolutely. Another thing that I found very, intense and in the book is that you talk about sunset towns, and we also think of those somewhat as being like, from movies about the South, people being like, you have to get out of here, you can't be seen here after sunset. But, I'm from Connecticut, and your book prompts everyone, I think, to go look up where they were from to figure out if they were a sunset town too. And like up until the, mid 60s, there were something like 20 sunset towns in Connecticut alone. And then you had talk about them in the Rust Belt and in California and on and on. Mary Lynn here had a question that, did the Green Book list the sunset towns? So that's an interesting question too, because speak to Alvin Green's,
Yes.
careful approach to all these things.
Well, Victor Green was very, very careful about his use of language in the book. I don't think the word racism is never in the book. Jim Crow is used, but in an article that's quoting someone or citing a law in another state. That's the only time those types of words appear. Victor Green was very much aware that a lot of the information he gathered into that magazine were from various sources. So he was very, very careful. He never talked about sundown towns explicitly in the book and never used the term. But in the African-American community, this information was handed down by word of mouth based on experience from one person to another. So in essence, if you think about the Negro Motorist Green Book, it was the physical manifestation of that word of mouth, which had existed in the African-American community for decades. Sundown towns were more a phenomena of the North than the South. Illinois No, wrong. Indiana had the highest number of any state. Ohio was up there. So was Detroit. I met this wonderful tour guide in Detroit, and he talked about how Detroit not only had sundown towns, but sundown suburbs. It was that rigid. And a lot of towns in the North, as white people began to get mortgages as a part of the GI Bill, a lot of the communities were made to be white by the federal government. The Federal Housing Authority actually had a policy that said that when making mortgage loans, no loans could be made that would encourage the integration of different parties or different races. It was that explicit.
Yeah, actually,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to read a couple of comments. There's the Facebook chat is going off. They found this so interesting and so affecting, especially someone was saying that subtle stories are so important, and especially for people who shared them with you in your research. So hearing about them have brought tears to their eyes. And there's many comments like that, but I just have a question from Sylvia. She said, there's currently an incredible quilt on display at the International Quilt Museum featuring the Green Book. In your research, did you come across any textile arts related?
The only textile art I came across related to it was an exhibition by the contemporary artist Derek Adams. He had a show at the Museum of Art and Design called Sanctuary. And in that, he took images from, he was inspired by the Green Book to create doors and hangings and wooden carvings and other textile-based art to reflect what it was like to travel during that period of time. The exhibition has gone around to different locations in America, but that was the only thing that we found during the trip. The Green Book has now become inspiration for many contemporary artists. In fact, we have a chapter on that that talks about how artists are using this information to create things that capture both the problematic aspects of traveling, but also the joy of being on the road.
Yeah, I was thinking one of the amazing things about your book too is that it promotes interaction, whether it be you go out on your own road trip with the Green Book, or you look up your town in the Green Book, or the part with the art. Really, I thought, this is the kind of things that you have your kids respond to the book, in terms of their, visual ideas around it. I just thought there's a lot there.
Yes.
Michael, sorry.
Yes, I was going to say, and it brings up conversations within families.
Yeah.
Like, why does my grandmother always want to leave at 3:30 in the morning when she takes a trip?
Yeah.
Or why do people always pack all this food in the car when they're on the road? There are all these little habits that have been passed on generationally that I think this book will help people decipher and talk about in their families. In those families that talk about these things, one of the most powerful sections of the book is the story of T. Marie King in Montgomery, Alabama, and how when she was in the National Memorial of Peace and Justice, the lynching museum, she looked up and saw the name of her uncle or great uncle actually, on the wall, on one of the jars there, having been subject to terror, but yet her relatives never talked about it. And she talked about what it was like to grow up in that family and the distinction between why she believed the older generation didn't talk about it, and while the younger generation, not as effective about it, didn't talk about it. And she said she had to be constantly sensitive to where the person is in their journey of accepting this information and wanting to talk about it.
Yeah. I think I even told you that it prompted me to talk to my 91-year-old father about what he witnessed. And he was, working in New York, and he had stories too of, like the, Black students who were, brought into his high school. And it was the first time there was any kind of desegregation in some of these schools. Michael, could we look at a few more of the images, and we can just sort of quickly describe what we're looking at. These are all images from the Green Book. This is an amazing picture. And this shows the car culture, right, Alvin?
Yes.
It's great. It's an Easter picture with these young boys. And then the next one, this is a picture of the people in the Great Migration, setting out on the road. And this one's very, just so upsetting and striking and all the rest. It was actually part of a government project to document segregation in the South, actually. So this is a man going up to a movie theater and has to go in the back entrance. And this one is about the walls that segregated new white developments from Black developments. Can you talk about this a little, Alvin?
Yes, I don't think many Americans are aware that the equivalent of the Berlin Wall actually exists in Detroit. I didn't know until we got to Detroit, and Jamal took us there, and I was stunned. And the wall came about because the developer of this suburban area was building houses where Black people were living too close to white people. And the federal government threatened to suspend any mortgage loans to anybody who bought these houses. So the solution approved by the US government was for the developer to build this wall. I think it was about a half a mile long or a mile long, 6 feet high, that would separate the white community from the Black community, from the African-American community. And therefore, the government would continue to make loans because the loans were not encouraging the mixing of the races. It's
stories
amazing.
like this that make you like
exist today.
I mean, basically editing the book, you're like, I'm half like crying.
Yes.
Have cheered on by people's, again, resilience. Could you, Michael, could you keep going a couple more, just a few more images, because I want to get to one. So that's Lorraine Motel. And then the next one, this is part of the resort town imagery. And there's so many great pictures of just people loving their lives and enjoying these resort towns. And then we'll come to that one. We'll talk about Doogie Chase in a minute, but I want to get to one other picture. That's the one. Okay, that's Alvin as a boy, which is such a beautiful picture. And I want you to just talk a little bit about, what do you remember? Like, because this is part of the book too, is that when we get towards the end of the book, you've told us, you've taken us on the journeys. You've talked about the wisdom that's been passed down between the generations and the living witnesses you come across. And then you talk about your memories, because you were in Florida, you grew up in Florida. Could you tell everyone a bit about that?
Yes, this is a part of the book, and I sort of put this a little bit throughout the entire book, is about living in the Black community in a sort of self-sustaining way without an awareness or without your lives being in reaction to the white world. I was raised in a small village of about 52 people in the Florida Panhandle, and all of them were my relatives. I had an incredibly happy childhood because I didn't know anything about the outside world. My parents were really, really protective of us, and they essentially gave us the freedom to believe in ourselves and to grow. And we were really nurtured by the community. And it was only after I was an adult that I realized the extent of the protection. For example, when we would go to Tallahassee, Florida to buy groceries, there was Monroe Street and Adams Street. Those were the two streets we went on. And I would go to South Adams Street because that's where I think they had the McQuarrie, McClendon, and Green store, and I would buy my Viewmaster slides at that store. And that became something that I just loved, to look at Viewmaster slides. And but those were still deep segregation days. And so as we were walking down the street, our parents were very much concerned that we would run into a white person that could generate an action. And the parents had this sort of waltz that they did, which I only thought about as an adult. As we were approaching a white person, my mother would distract us. Oh, look at that steeple on the church over there. And then she would gradually place herself between us and the white person and keep us as far away as possible. And then as the white person passed, she was always monitoring. She would relax. And then if somebody was coming on the other side, she'd distract us in the opposite direction and get us our attention over there. So we always thought that she was just pointing out things that were really pretty, but it was really protection for all of us. It's brilliant to think about that protective walls that so many Black parents did to keep their children safe, because they all knew there would come a time when they would not be able to protect them anymore.
Yeah. Virginia, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, this has been fascinating. We could go on, and we'll squeeze in as much time, as many questions as we can. But there's a couple of questions, interestingly enough, from several different people, which all sort of have the same theme. Some are comments and some are questions, but you'll see what I mean. So Donna says, it's so sad that there are Facebook groups still needed to provide this information to keep people safe. There is, Donna says again, do you have hope that the need for these resources will end in our lifetime? There are still such terrible stories of people being made to feel unsafe. And then follow-up question from Lillian Dabney, is there still a need for something like the Green Book in our contemporary world? And so it's interesting to see that there are several questions like that, and they all want to know the same thing.
Yes, the reaction to that question, which I posed to many people during our trip, was almost generationally divided. The older generation, people of my time, born in the 50s and 60s and 70s, no, we will not tolerate the existence of the Green Book. People always say, I pay my taxes, my father fought in the war, my mother served in the military. No, we are Americans, we're part of this country. We don't want to go back to that. Younger people are, and the second part of that first generation, they then say that if there was a Green Book that contained Black businesses that they could patronize when they travel, they would enjoy that. And so they see it as a potential marketing tool to help support Black businesses as they go around America. Younger people have a wholly different point of view. They say, well, the Green Book is necessary, but we recognize that you can feel uncomfortable in places. So therefore we form these Facebook groups. There's Black Twitter, there's Airbnb Noir, and there's all these places where you can find places that are friendly to you. I think that Jan Miles, who lives in New Orleans, who created I think it's called the Negro Green Book, which really is an accumulation of atrocities against Black people on the road, said it best. She said, we need to think about this situation in terms of our own lives. She said her grandmother was alive when all those lynchings were occurring in the South, and all of the segregation rules were in place. And although the laws were changed, those people you saw in those pictures, some of them are still alive, and those people had children, and they're still alive, and then those people had children. Just because a law changed doesn't mean that the attitude or feeling has changed, as we have seen in recent years. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those situations where we are always hopeful it will change. We should all work toward the change, but we should also be vigilant, because what we have and what we have achieved feels fragile at times. Yeah. It feels very fragile. So be diligent, work toward the time when these things will not be necessary, but be aware that some people hold on to these things deeply and in ways that are dangerous for African Americans. Whether you're running in a suburb or driving on a road, you could encounter one of these people.
Mm. Yes.
Seven
I,
children.
I have, okay, I think we're almost out of time, and maybe if people want to pose a couple more questions, we can get to them. But I would ask this, if parents want to read the book with their kids, how do you think they could get the most out of it? Like, is there anything that,
Oh, that's a very good question. I think there are certain chapters in the book that are a delight to learn about. I think the chapters on the Black Edens, all of the Black resorts in America, it's really a beautiful chapter because it's something that most people don't know about. And what it was like for these Black professionals to go to these places where they were away from the white gaze. They could just be themselves and have a great time. And it will also educate people that not everybody in America lived in a ghetto, that narrative of inner city blight. People had lives away from that.
yeah.
The chapters on Little Harlems, I think, is another one, and I think to talk to people about, let's go to Nashville and walk down the street there that was the Little Harlem of Nashville, or the Little Harlem of Louisville, or the Little Harlem of Detroit. I think that's a way of talking about it in an interesting and productive way. And I also think the first chapter of the book, in which I describe how my own journey with this, is a good way of doing it. I think you choose the chapters depending upon the age of the child and how the child could understand what was going on. Even the sections where we talk about people's travel habits by generation, that's also a very good chapter, because it'll make people think about why people do certain things, why a relative may act this way, or why they may say this. It brings it into focus for the child and also feeds their imagination and understanding.
Yeah, and we'll make everyone want to have a shoebox lunch, because that was you do a great job of describing the incredibly delicious food that would be put in a shoebox for each person on the journey in the car, and it was just packed with great food and as part of the real pleasures of the road. The other thing I would like to make sure we talk about, just as we're closing, is that the book overall too, I think, really makes you make the point that people can make a big change in the world, not necessarily, I mean, it's great that people go out and protest, and that has to happen and all that, but you can make a big change being a postal carrier, doing this side project that's all clerical essentially. And can you just briefly talk about that, and before we have to go?
Yes, I often think about a really good friend of mine who lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and she taught at the Cathedral School in DC for many years. We went to Bowdoin College together. We're still friends. And her name is Tawana Cook. And she talked to me frequently about how sometimes you make change one person at a time as a teacher. And then other people, you can make change by doing something in your local community, like starting a newsletter, starting a blog. It doesn't have to be national, but it can spread, it can grow. So all of us need to have some degree of agency in making the change possible in our lives and in our communities. One of the quotes that lingers with me, and that's become a sort of mantra in my life, was delivered to me by Frank Figures in Jackson, Mississippi. This is a very difficult one for me to talk about, actually, because Frank was like my uncle's son. I mean, I couldn't get my uncle's son's voice out of my head when I was listening to Frank. And he said, you have to do what you can with what you have, where you are, in order to make the world a better place and a fairer deal. That's a variation on a statement that was made by Theodore Roosevelt. But when you hear Frank Figures say it, he owns it, he believes it, he inspired me and everyone else to take that and act on it. So do what you can, where you are, with what you have, to make the world a better place and a fairer deal.
Yeah. Well, Alvin, I think you've done that with this book. And I'm just delighted to have been able to talk to you about the book more. And Virginia and Michael and Lainey, thank you all so much for putting this together and hosting everyone.
And I want to thank you, Biz, for being so wonderful as an editor who helped me to reshape the book and stay in touch with my real emotions, what I was feeling, and giving me the courage to really ask questions in the book, which were the questions going on in my mind during the interviews, the question about American society today, and going down a road. I think what I do by asking some of the questions in the book is that I'm actually thinking what the reader would think. And I thank you for that.
Well, Alvin, it was an honor.
Well, I can say that it's been an honor for us as well to have both of you on. You know, it's such a unique relationship that author and editor have together. And this is such an important and beautiful book. As you say before, Biz, you know, the moments when it's sad and moments of beauty as well in this book. And if everybody adheres to what Alvin just said, if everybody can do what they can, and you said it so eloquently, but do what you can where you are and make a difference. The comments on the Facebook chat line and the room is just people saying how important this and moving this hour has been, and an incredible presentation, and that you are inspiring. And Sylvia writes, my hope, and she directs this at you, Alvin, my hope is you are incredibly proud of this work. And why wouldn't you be? Because it is absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
And Biz, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. It really was. I want to close with a quote from Bakari Sellers, New York Times bestselling author of My Vanishing Country. He says, Alvin Hall's Driving the Green Book is a tour de force, blending exhaustive research, exquisite writing, and emotionally resonant visuals. The book is also a testament to Black resilience during the Jim Crow era, the strategic thinking that helped Black families not only endure, but to prevail over tyrannical anti-Black laws, and the ingenuity that held Black communities together from east to west, north to south. This is a must read. Driving the Green goes on sale January 31st, 2023. Thank you both so much for taking this hour with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.